Wuhan goes into lockdown.
Italy, decimated by the coronavirus.
We are seeing each day more new cases.
Suffering and healthcare disparity.
Unspeakable tragedy.
Democracy is at a crossroads. Autocrats have wind in their sails. COVID-19 has called into question old assumptions about freedom, capitalism, and global cooperation. And democracies around the world are under increasing pressure. That is why we need to come together for the defense of democracy and freedom more than ever. This year, in a very special virtual edition of the conference, we will use the technologies that connect us to strengthen our democracies. And we invite you to join us. We will discuss the challenges of protecting the health of our people and our democracies with current leaders from politics, tech, business, and democracy activism. And we will commit to actions that will protect our freedoms, elections, and data in the future. Together, we will overcome and ensure that we emerge from this hour more united and more confident. I look forward to continuing this important dialogue with you. Thank you, and we welcome you to the Copenhagen Democracy Summit 2020.
Good afternoon, good evening, morning, wherever you are in the world right now. I want to wish you a very warm welcome to this virtual Copenhagen Democracy Summit. My name is Ryan Heath. I'm Politico's senior editor and the author of our Global Translations newsletter and podcast. We've got 2 days of challenging and inspiring conversations coming up, including my interview with Hong Kong activist Joshua Wong in just a few minutes. We're live on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. And for those of you who registered for the event, you should have all received details of how to log into the virtual conference room, which is a great feature for those who've signed up. So do check your inbox for those details if you don't have them in front of you. 2020 feels like a year that we're all going to look back on as a global turning point. It's not yet clear what historical frame we're going to be applying to it, but that's what these discussions are for. If democracy means anything, it means the ability to shape one's future and that of one's community. I'd now like to introduce Jonas Parello-Plesner from the Alliance. Jonas is going to give us the inside gossip on the summit. So welcome, Jonas.
Thank you, Ryan. Well, and first of all, thanks to you for sticking with us. When I proposed this Copenhagen Democracy Summit, initially, it was about you coming to Copenhagen, standing at a big stage. And now we're, of course, because of the pandemic, doing this just from studio and from your home. So it's of course a sort of different feel, but we decided that even though the pandemic upended lives in many ways, it also upended the way you could do summits. And we said we still wanted to do this virtually, as we heard it from Anders Fogh Rasmussen, our chairman. We thought the need for a Copenhagen Democracy Summit and for safeguarding our democracies, as we also safeguard our health, was as vital as ever. And as you just said, I think we tried to recreate a bit of that sort of summit vibe by having all the invited guests that we normally invite to sit in sort of the plush red armchairs and in the Copenhagen Playhouse that we just saw. They're all now able to sit on a streaming service, follow us. All of you should have a good function where you can ask questions that can be part of the debate. But as you said, we also wanted to bring it out way broader. So we are now also on Facebook Live, on Twitter, on YouTube. So when there are people out there that also follow this, do also chip in. We have 2 sort of conference hashtags of today. It's CDS 2020. It's hashtag Defend Democracy.
And what are the main themes going to be over the next couple of days?
Of course, I mean, the pandemic has put a big sort of new overlay over this. But at the same time, many of the themes that we already work with in the foundation, they're actually still really relevant and have actually been exacerbated by the pandemic. So the question of democratic backsliding in countries, that's really a big question now here. Are governments taking steps not just to curb the pandemic, but broader to curb journalist freedom, excessive sort of restrictions on movement for the population, curbing opposition. So, and the same when it comes to the sort of pushing back on authoritarianism, we've seen China really sort of presenting its sort of model as the one that would survive the crisis better. In Europe, use a lot of its so-called mass diplomacy. So those are like themes that on election interference and disinformation, that's a big theme we aboard as well. We are now talking about the infodemic just as well as the pandemic. So that's another theme that we have as part of the summit. And of course, finally, but definitely not least, there's also this big question mark around U.S. global leadership, in particular on democracy, that we're also going to talk about during these Tuesdays.
100%. We're definitely going to get into the theme of US leadership in the second session today. So you've given us the hashtags, Defend Democracy and CDS 2020. Are there any other protocols or tips that people need to know to get the most out of the sessions today?
Well, I mean, sit back, enjoy it. You're at home. There's no jet lag. There's no hotel bookings to take care of. You have to bring the popcorn and create the same atmosphere. I mean, as if you're in the audience, do send your claps. Now you can only be on sort of virtual emojis, but do still pass them along to us and to the speakers when you hear something you like or something where you want to chip in. So, I mean, I'm excited about this day. As you said, we're going to hear from Joshua Wong from Hong Kong, who since he was 14 has been fighting for democracy. So he started at a tender age, and I could definitely say we've gotten quite a good amount of Chinese coverage, negative coverage, that he is joining us. So I think he's an important voice to be heard among us. And this whole day actually here, Thursday, is as if we were in the Royal Playhouse, dedicated to our breakout sessions, to democracy activism, where we want to also say, yes, there are all these difficulties here during the pandemic, but we also want to be optimistic and say there are also innovative ways. Like we do this summit, people have figured out doing virtual town hall meetings, figured out new ways of keeping up sort of the democracy activism flame. So that's also what we want to, in our sort of 3 breakout sessions during the day, want to achieve today.
Well, I guess one final question before we move on to Joshua, and it's around that reaction to his participation, to the president of Taiwan who's joining tomorrow. I know that my Danish friends have been contacting me in a way that I wasn't expecting, because it's clearly caused a bit of a fuss there, and you're getting some pushback from China. How has that been, and has that changed your approach to the next 2 days at all?
No, I mean, not at all. I mean, in a sense, we see it as a sort of hallmark, I would say, of that we're doing something relevant, that we're putting democracy on the agenda in a way that an authoritarian system doesn't like, that wants to sort of quell dissent, wants to sort of, I mean, oddly and paradoxically enough, China always professes they're about non-interference in other countries and saying, but at the same time, they want to decide who's going to go on stage at a virtual summit that takes place thousands of kilometers away from Beijing's jurisdiction. So there's something, quite paradoxical about that.
And well, very good work. We've seen some fights that China's struck with Sweden, with Norway. So it's a bit of a theme up in your neighborhood, but I'm glad that you're going ahead regardless. I think it's now about time to bring Joshua onto the screen. So while we do that, let me just introduce the session. And thank you so much, Jonas, for giving us all of that background. Joshua, of course, you will have seen him on your TV screens and in your newspapers and filling your inboxes. He is the Secretary General of Demosisto, which is the coordinating unit for the Hong Kong protests. And the session that we are now going to have, it'll be a short one, is Fighting for Democracy, from the Battlegrounds of Hong Kong. And don't forget that after we have this conversation, Joshua is going to be taking your questions live on Twitter. So you can use the hashtag AskJWong, and he will, just a few minutes after the end of the session, answer as many questions as he can. We're so grateful to have him. So let me just check now if Joshua is available to join us. Joshua, are you there yet? No? Well, let me fill you in then as we get that ready. The G7 has put out a statement yesterday in the last 24 hours. That's the way that some of these forums work. They get to the game a little late sometimes, but usually they're on the right side of the discussion. And that is putting into question China's latest efforts to revise Hong Kong's basic law. The wording is as you would expect. We are going to wait and see whether that has any impact. I'm going to ask Joshua whether he finds those questions implementing. Okay, we're getting Joshua ready now, and we'll be with you back in just a few seconds. Thank you so much for joining us. And welcome back to the virtual Copenhagen Democracy Summit. I'm Ryan Heath, Senior Editor at Politico. And joining me now is Joshua Wong, who we introduced earlier, from Hong Kong's protest movement. Thank you so much, Joshua.
Thank you so much for inviting me to speak, Ryan. I say this knowing I might not have the chance to do so again in the future. And this is not an exaggeration. Many of you still recall the scene when millions of Hong Kongers took to the street last year. We opposed the extradition arrangement that would have essentially allowed legalized kidnapping. Hong Kongers found guilty of breaking Chinese law could be sent to stand trial in a Beijing court. The authorities eventually withdrew the bill under tremendous pressure, but they also respond our demand to full democracy with oppressive policing force. The number of arrested protesters since last summer is already more than the number of prisoners in Hong Kong right now. More than 1,000 were arrested and charged with rioting. Many more injured or even went missing. This prolonged struggle with the Chinese Communist Party for years now, the umbrella movement broke out in 2014, demanding that Beijing live up to its promise of democracy. But rather than doing so in honor of the Sino-British Joint Declaration in 1984, Emperor Xi Jinping crackdown on our autonomy has only intensified over time. What Xi Jinping learned from Hong Kong's democratic movement last year is to become more draconic and oppressive. It would be best to have me sent across the border to stand trial directly rather than to engage in dynamic diplomatic talks and negotiation. Therefore, precisely 1 year afterward, when I'm attending this summit, Beijing's legislature, the NPCSC, at the same time holds meetings, finalizing a sweeping national security law that targets democratic activists like myself. Under the pretext of national security, this law purports to target acts of collusion with foreign force. Beijing did not define what is collusion, but it will result in massive discretionary power to punish activists and electoral candidates on the one hand, and cut off Hong Kong from the international society and their crucial support on the other. Take this occasion as an example. I'm convinced that every word comes from my mouth today could well become proof of crime at the Chinese courtroom in the near future. Worse still, not only can democratic activists and lawmakers who have participated in international advocacy efforts be barred from running election or even imprisoned. NGOs and other organizations, including their personnel and assets, can also be subject to legal persecution. So the development in Hong Kong have changed quite swiftly from 2019. Large-scale protests defying the communist government may no longer be an option. It could be my last testimony when I'm still free. Yes, prosecuted and put behind bars under the sweeping security law. Our long march to democracy will be forced into a prolonged period of crackdown, perhaps similar to what Poland experienced in the communist era, with secret police agency stationed in the city. With such situation, this scenario may create a stark contrast with the impression we usually have to a cosmopolitan Hong Kong famous for its international financial center in the previous day. The economic freedom, free flow of information, and freedom of capital we used to enjoy in Hong Kong will fade away after the law imposed it. It's also the threat over all investors and expats living and working on this island. I think now is the proof of how Hong Kongers experience. When geopolitical tension intensify, expats can fall victims to the ill-defined law and China's hostage diplomacy. In the past, 2 Canadian nationals were detained for nearly 2 years as retaliation to Huawei executive Wang Wangzhou arrest, let alone Swedish NGO worker Peter Dahlin, Australian writer Yang, and Taiwanese NGO activist Li. Foreign journalists, human rights workers, and academics were barred from Hong Kong. When China made Communist Party's security its priority, no one is safe. Citizen journalists, booksellers, NGO workers, religious groups, online bloggers, booksellers, writers, human rights defenders, or even critics of government policy are put behind bars. Amnesty International also raised concern about its spill-out effect on economic activities and online speech. Once the law, national security law, reached out its course to each beacon of liberty on China's soil, this vibrant civil society is on the brink of collapse. Certainly, I would devote whatever effort I can to define this new round of oppression. But Beijing continued move to crush democracy in Xinjiang and in Hong Kong also explain the Goliath we are facing is not as what we experienced and expect look like in the previous day. In the past 2 decades, Beijing's aggressive expansion in Europe, Asia, and Africa has given a warning signal to democratic states all over the world. The world is awakening from the Chinese nightmare. If we are determined to safeguard democratic aspiration, we must act to define China's dictatorial grip. I will hope to let more people aware that towards democracy is really the uphill battle. In Hong Kong, we have experienced many depressing moments last year when state mobilized mob attacked passengers in the metro station, when police forcefully enter the university campus, arrest and torture students, when witnessing countless students younger than I were, especially millennials, were put behind bars. What drives us continue the struggle? My answer is compassion. As my dear friend Brian said, Hong Kong belongs to everyone who shares its pain. In the previous year, we burst into tears mourning the death of protesters. We share boxes of surgical masks to one another to defend ourselves from the coronavirus from Wuhan. I also pray for protesters who are forced to leave our home because of their sacrifice in the protest movement. I pray for brothers who are struggling in jail now. And I pray for those who will become political refugees soon. They are the reason why I'm still fighting in this uphill battle. As we grow in pain, in tears, and in compassion, I believe we shall succeed one day. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joshua. In the face of all that, can I ask you, when a forum like the G7 puts out a statement like they did yesterday in support of democracy in Hong Kong, is that response of any meaningful value, or does your movement need something else from the world's democracies right now?
I'm glad to learn that the G7 foreign ministers spoke on this issue firmly today. In the past, there were cases that Europeans were victims of the national security law, such as Swedish angel worker Peter. I hope that concerted effort will continue to prevent Beijing from making further mistakes. And I also hope to emphasize what happened, and I believe it's also important for EU to take more action. Especially all we realize is how EU founding treaty emphasized on the importance of human rights. But it seems that under the uprising power of China, they are adopting appeasement policy. In fact, EU pledged itself to be a normative player and human rights advocator in its Charter of the Fundamental Human Rights. And it stated that EU and its member states will not directly or indirectly involve in human rights violation. But yet, EU has not fulfilled its responsibility, but encouraging China to further expand its authoritarian rule in Xinjiang, Tibet, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. So I think actions speak louder than words. EU has multiple tools that it can make use to discourage China from systematic violation of human rights. No matter imposing embargoes of all dual-use goods and technology, imposing sanctions, legislation like Magnitsky Act, and so on. I think now is the time the EU, apart from issue statement calling for dialogue, it's important to carry out any actual action to let Beijing realize that the world will stand with Hong Kong.
Thank you. Thinking about Britain now, they have obviously made the gesture in recent weeks to offer a pathway to residency and citizenship. And you've called those visas as a lifeboat. And what the UK really should be doing is standing up to China. Do you think that the UK is going for the easy option here? Are they walking away from you by offering this pathway?
That's really a good question. I think it's a lifeboat for Hong Kongers and last resort. Of course, it would be a good move. But people sort of gave up as there was a feeling that there was nothing we could do and we all had nowhere to go. And it's like we had accepted our fate. And I hope the BNO campaign would provide an exit plan so that people can fight hard and they know that there is still a way out and a home no matter we win or lose. So I think it's not a sign of giving up Hong Kong, but more to encourage people in Hong Kong and in the global community fight until the last minute and they still have a home to go. And from the perspective of UK, I think the strongest leverage is UK is the signatory of the UN Registered International Treaty, the Joint Declaration. However, it's lack of remedy that could be sought even there's a breach by China. If declaring the Joint Declaration is void, the UK would even lose the legitimacy or the position to speak up for Hong Kong. Therefore, I think BNO campaign or how we focus on the BNO citizenship, it provides the UK's second largest leverage for involving and speak up for Hong Kong. And I really wish, apart from figure out the BNO arrangement or how to grant full citizenship for Hong Kong people that under threat, I think more important is how to continue to put pressure on Beijing apart from the lifeboat.
Now we have a question from the online audience. Dan Shu and Socorro Reyes have questions that I'll join together. So the two questions are, in the latest Hong Kong local elections, 42% of the total votes went to pro-establishment, i.e. pro-Beijing parties. How should those voters be mobilized? And at the same time, given what we've seen with some of the recent American protests against racism and police brutality, how are you working to prevent your movement from being infiltrated by outsiders, be they anarchists, looters, or Beijing agents?
In last November, there is a landslide victory for pro-democratic camp because more than 85% of the seats won by pro-democratic camp in the district council election, which proved the silent majority in Hong Kong stand on the side of fellow protesters. And we are also aware that on September will be the upcoming legislative council election in Hong Kong. and whether Beijing will disqualify more candidates or cancel the election or bar more young activists just like me to run for office or etc. That should also be the situation should be concerned. So I think no matter the implementation of the national security law or the upcoming election scheduled on early September, how will be the reaction of Beijing after they wish to implement this evil law to Hong Kong? It should deserve under the global spotlight. And refer to the clash and a protest happen not only no matter in Hong Kong, in Europe or in US. How to solve the political crisis by political system reform and to stop the police brutality is always the responsibility of the administration and those leaders being elected. Unfortunately, in Hong Kong, even Hong Kong people, lots of us experience the police brutality. The leader is not chosen by us, which means that even in the later or in the upcoming few years, we have discontent to the government. We still even can't have a vote to show our dissatisfaction to kick that leader out from the government.
We have a question from Gideon Feen, and he's asking how your protest movement and organization has adapted to the pandemic. I know obviously that you have been very good on that front, but what was the process like, and how do you keep it moving when we've seen in so many places around the world that the pandemic has given the police more powers, or we've seen the military actually take up a much more visible role in managing and enforcing law?
No doubt at all how Beijing took the advantage during the outbreak of COVID-19 when the world is dealing with the pandemic export from China to the world, and they suddenly plan to introduce this evil law to Hong Kong and to silence the voice of the civil society. It's lucky that the COVID-19 outbreak in Hong Kong almost ended already. So in the previous few months, apart from importing surgical masks all over the world, we also have virtual protests to have a protest online. And we also will gather people on social media and how to keep our momentum by different kind of online live stream or etc. And on June 4th, which is the commemoration of the Tiananmen Square massacre, 2 weeks ago, even Beijing and Hong Kong government banned our authorized assembly. More than 100,000 people still never forget how Beijing cracked down on the protests 31 years ago in Tiananmen Square. And when even with the excuse of the COVID-19, how the government stopped our protests, we still gather on street and hope to keep the momentum. And we hope to let the world to know that when Beijing is taking advantage, no matter during the outbreak of COVID-19, silence the voice of activists and dissidents and journalists in China, Hong Kong, and all over the world. At the same time, they also hope to have more interference in the economic sector. And we also hope to put pressure and let the world to know that it's not only about the fight for Hong Kong. The first is Hong Kong, the next is Taiwan, and later on is the rest of the world.
It's a very important point. If I can switch it now to one last question. Obviously, in many protest movements, the involvement of other institutions, for example, large companies, can be quite important, or it's of increasing importance in many of those movements. So I want to give a personal example here. I have a mortgage with a bank called HSBC. They've recently said that essentially they would support Beijing when it came down to the crunch. What do you hope someone like me does to show solidarity with the protesters, given the stance of companies like HSBC?
I perfectly understand big companies are under great pressure because of the pandemic. At the same time, in Hong Kong, HSBC is often the target of political attack by pro-Beijing political leader, accusing this major bank in Hong Kong not patriotic enough to the communist regime and was a colonial financial institution. Under such heavy pressure, however, it doesn't make bowing to China or kowtow to Beijing recognized as kind of wise choice. It affects the reputation of HSBC in the global economy. Especially HSBC staff in Hong Kong could risk violating the law by merely writing accurate financial analysis. I think as investor, the best way to safeguard your interests is to voice out when you find something goes wrong. That's how a democratic society should work like. Especially Hong Kong is more than compromise the place I call home. And when Hong Kong is in the difficult times, I think it's not only about the fight of Hong Kong, especially when we stand on the forefront to confront the largest authoritarian regime. We are also sharing the value that the free world stands for. So how to speak up as the stakeholders and also one of the investor, I think is also matter, especially how red capital interference in Hong Kong or Beijing affecting the global economy and never respect on economic freedom, which is really critical. Lots of people might always assume that the protest in Hong Kong is just about political right. Of course, the right to elect our government is important. But for no matter the controversial extradition bill in 2019, or right now the national security law in Hong Kong, is not only about political issue, it's also about the economic freedom, the free market, free port, and also the free flow of information might fade out soon after the law is implemented in the upcoming few weeks. So I will sum up, the clock is kicking and time is running out in Hong Kong, and we really call on the world to stand with us and let Beijing to realize that this fight is not only about Hong Kong.
That's a very important point to end on. The clock's also ticking on us, Joshua, so I have to say thank you and goodbye there. But I want to remind everyone that you'll be answering questions on Twitter starting in about 15 minutes. So if you have more questions that we didn't cover here, use the hashtag AskJWong, and Joshua will be there on Twitter answering them for you. Thank you so much for joining us, Joshua.
Thank you.
Now, coming up next.